Okay, good morning. So today we will be discussing the phytochemicals. Now, this is an area of herbal medicine that I have a lot of interest in. I'm pretty passionate about it. My background's chemistry, and I did a lot of courses in natural products chemistry. Um, and I find the phytochemicals particularly interesting because the medicinal properties associated with plants is linked to various phytochemicals. Now, a single plant never consists of just one phytochemical. There's going to be hundreds and hundreds of phytochemicals within a herb. And these phytochemicals, some of them will have a medicinal action that's important and has a significant effect on contributing to the herbal actions. And some of them won't have any appreciable effects. So when it comes to phytochemicals, it's interesting to understand that a herb that's useful for a particular condition could have dozens of different phytochemicals. And this is one of the reasons why when you look at the actions associated with herbs, there may be numerous actions associated with a single herb. And that herb could be used to treat multiple different conditions as well. So some herbs may be an anti-inflammatory, an antioxidant, maybe a digestive bitter, may act as a carminative. All these different things could be associated with multiple phytochemicals that exist in that plant. So when we discuss the phytochemicals, we're going to look at the different ways that you can classify these phytochemicals to help us better understand how they work and how they're classified. So we're going to look at the classification of phytochemicals and how we classify them, and they can be classified by various ways. Second of all, I'm going to try to explain how the medicinal actions are associated with various classes of phytochemicals. I'm going to try to see if I can summarize some actions that are associated with the different classes. And then we're going to use some herbal examples for these as well. So, what is a phytochemical? Well, everything in the universe is made up of chemicals, and phytochemicals specifically refer to the chemicals that you find in plants. So phytochemicals, plant-based chemicals. I may use the term interchangeably with plant constituents. So a constituent is the various components in the plant. And these basically are compounds that are produced by plants. Some of them may be produced by animals as well, or insects and other organisms. But we're going to focus on the ones that are produced by plants. And when you look, as I mentioned earlier, plants make hundreds or thousands of different types of phytochemicals, and the medicinal properties associated with the plants are linked to these phytochemicals. And when we were discussing earlier about nutrition, I may have mentioned that in the past, nutrition focused primarily on, let's say, the macronutrients, where you needed to have a certain amount of protein and fat and carbohydrates just to stay alive and have enough fuel to run around and do what you need to. In addition to the macronutrients, you need the micronutrients. And these micronutrients are things like the vitamins and the minerals, where if you don't get enough of a particular vitamin or a mineral, you can get a deficiency disease from not having them. So if you don't have enough vitamin C, you'll get scurvy, or not enough vitamin B3, you'll get pellagra. So these are essential compounds that you can't exist without them. If you don't have them, you'll die because certain things, or essentially you'll die because you just don't have the cofactors required for certain enzymes and proteins to work properly. Now, the third type of nutrient is what's called the non-essential nutrients. And these are the various phenolic compounds. And these could be things like bioflavonoids or sesquiterpene lactones, or all sorts of different phytochemicals that, although you don't need them to live, these non-essential nutrients, these phytochemicals, help prevent various diseases like heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. And so a lot of the phytochemicals that we're going to describe, they're found in herbs, but they're also found in common fruits and vegetables that we consume in our diet. As I mentioned, herbal actions are always going to be associated with some type of phytochemical. And the final thing that we'll also describe just a little bit is how the different phytochemicals, whether they're polar or non-polar. And what that means is if something is polar, it dissolves well in water, and if something is non-polar, it dissolves more in a type of a non-polar solvent like an oil. Now, certain phytochemicals dissolve well in water, some of them dissolve well in oils, while other ones are kind of both polar and non-polar, and they're going to dissolve better in things like alcohol. When it comes to classifying phytochemicals, there are several ways that we can do that. First of all, you can classify them based on their chemical structure. So you may have heard of phenolic or polyphenol compounds. What these compounds all have in common is that they contain a phenolic group. Phenolic groups are generally associated with anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects. So you can classify based on the structure of it. Another way that we can classify it is based on a particular property. For example, essential oils or volatile oils. These would be things like tea tree oil, eucalyptus oil, oregano oil. The way that you obtain these is you basically blow steam through the herbs, heat them up a little bit, and the essential oils, the small compounds that are typically 10 to 15 carbons in size, they're not very heavy, so they'll evaporate off, and then you can collect them later on and separate it from the water, and that's how they get essential oils. So things like essential oils or volatile oils are based on the fact that you can extract them through steam distillation. Another way that you can classify phytochemicals is based on how the plant makes it. So whether they use a particular synthetic pathway to make them. So there is a large group of compounds called terpenoids that are made from isoprene units, and that's what the terpenoids are. And depending on how many of these isoprene units get stuck together will determine which subclass of the terpenoids you get, whether it's the monoterpenoids or the diterpenoids or triterpenoids, etc. Now finally, there's not a lot of examples, but there are some phytochemicals that are classified based on their medicinal action. So in the case of tannins, remember tannins possess an astringent nature to it, and there are hydrolyzable and non-hydrolyzable tannins. So these are classified based on their medicinal action, more or less. Now, most of those tannins are also going to act as phenolic compounds as well. They may have some other overlapping classes that they belong to, but they do have that one property. So one thing when it comes to phytochemicals that can be confusing for people is that one particular phytochemical, so let's say carbohydrate or thymol, it may belong to not just one of these various categories, but it could overlap with 2, 3, or even 4 of these different sections, categories. So to give you an example of this, in green are the terpenoids. This is based on how they're made by the plant, the synthetic pathway. Then you've got the phenolic compounds in purple on the right. That describes compounds based on whether they have a phenolic, basically a phenol group in it. And then that center sort of bubble there refers to the essential oils, and these can be obtained by steam distillation. And so you see there's a point where all these 3 categories overlap right in the middle where the arrow is pointing, and this would be something that would be classified as a terpenoid, as an essential oil, and as a phenolic. So oregano oil and thyme oil has various compounds that are monoterpenes that evaporate, so they're an essential oil, and they possess a phenol group on them. So it belongs to 3 of these categories that we've discussed. Now we're going to begin with carbohydrates. So I'm sure everybody knows that carbohydrates are made from sugars. And sugars are pretty fascinating structures because what's happened is the plant's basically taken sunlight and converted it into basically a chemical bond so that it's a relatively unstable compound that can release energy as required. So it's like a little battery. I mean, sugar, that's what it is. It's basically a little battery that stores energy. Now, in addition to providing an energy source, carbohydrates can have other functions in our body, and we'll go through and discuss this in a second. So sugars consist primarily of carbon molecules, hydrogens with high amounts of oxygens. Now, when it comes to polar compounds dissolve well in water, and they'll do this if they contain high amounts of either oxygen, nitrogens, or even sulfur molecules. And so those compounds, the oxygens and nitrogens and sulfurs, allow for these things to interact with water, and it's like they're little magnets that can have that positive negative charge within the molecule. And so carbohydrates in general are water soluble. That's important. Now, there are a number of different categories of carbohydrates we'll talk about. There are glycosides, fiber, mucilage, gels. Some of these things overlap and some of them don't. So in general, carbohydrates can have a number of different actions associated with it. So you can have a fuel source for humans, which would just be normal starch and sugars. But there are certain types of sugars that we don't break down, and these are various types of fibers. And these fibers have other medicinal properties associated with it. One thing, fiber, because we don't break it down, it acts as a fuel source for the good bacteria in our gut. So probiotics refers to the good bacteria. Prebiotics is the fuel that feeds the good bacteria in our gut. And so if you eat a diet that's rich in plant material, you'll be eating a lot of fiber, and it will basically provide food for certain types of bacteria and encourage the growth of those bacteria. I remember reading one study that basically said that if you were to eat, let's say, a fast food diet that was very low in plant material and had very little fiber in it, after about a week or two, you would actually have certain strains of bacteria would go extinct in your gut because you're not providing it with a food source. So it's really important for us to eat lots of fruits and vegetables in our diet, not just for ourselves, but because it helps to feed our gut flora. Now, another action that's important to do with carbohydrates is the demulcent action. So remember, demulcents help to soothe irritated mucous membranes, and they can do this by two mechanisms. Either they stimulate our body's mucus production, or demulcents basically supplement our body with mucilage, which is a type of fiber. And so that's one action. Fiber in our gut expands, stimulates stress receptors, and can act as a bulk laxative. So there's another important action associated with carbohydrates. We know that fiber in general has a hypoglycemic effect. It helps with diabetes, because what it does is it forms a sort of a gel or a thick matrix in our bowels, and that means that the sugars will move slower through the lumen of the bowel and will be absorbed slower. And so imagine if you were in a swimming pool and you replace the water with Jello, it would slow down your movement through the water. And so as a result, you wouldn't move as quick. And if instead of you look at sugar trying to move through a Jello or through a matrix, it'll move much slower. And this is going to reduce the spikes of sugar into your blood and have a positive effect on insulin levels. It'll kind of reduce the need for high peaks of insulin. Also, cholesterol has been shown to help to lower cholesterol. And then finally, certain types of fiber, not all of them, will have an immunomodulating or immunostimulating effect. Now, the first type of group of carbohydrates we're going to discuss are glycosides. Now, glycosides, these are a fairly large group of compounds that essentially you can add a sugar to almost any kind of phenolic compound and other types of compounds. And so a glycoside, the fact that it contains sugars isn't as important to me as what the non-sugar component is. So what we basically have, here's a little picture on the left-hand side, is a compound called salicin. This is one of the main compounds you'll find in willow bark. And that little structure at the bottom there that kind of looks like a Kermit frog little molecule, that's a glucose molecule. And so this is called a glycoside because you basically have some kind of organic compound attached to a sugar. Now, through the process of hydrolysis, which basically uses you can use an acid, you can use heat in the presence of water. It'll cleave off that sugar, releasing, in this case, salicylic acid. That's the aglycone, meaning the component that lacks the sugar, and you liberate the sugar molecule. So in this case, the glycoside is basically some kind of compound that has a sugar or one or two or more sugars attached to it. And when you remove those sugars, you get the two breakdown components, which is the aglycone, which A means no, glycone meaning sugar. And then at the bottom, you get the glucose molecule, in this case, which is the glycone, or the carbohydrate component. So why would a plant want to make a glycoside? Well, there's several benefits of being able to form glycosides. And plants aren't the only organisms that make it. We also make glycosides in our body. So when you add a sugar to some type of molecule, salicylic acid is sparingly soluble in water. But when you add a sugar to it, because you've increased the ratio of oxygen to carbon molecules, what it does is it makes that molecule much more water soluble. And so this is great for being able to do a couple things. One, you can store it. Because it's now more water soluble, it's going to have a harder time crossing against cell membranes. And so you're able to maybe store it in vesicles in the very cells to prevent it from going where you don't want it to. The second benefit is once you've made it more water soluble, because water is the main solvent in plants and animals, you can then move it around and from one area to another, or to excrete it by attaching the sugar onto it. So it's important for transporting these molecules around, and also from a detoxification standpoint, it's useful to be able to add sugar to this. So in humans, just to give you an example, things like estrogen, which are fat soluble, they don't really dissolve well in water at all. They can also cross cell membranes. So if you apply like an estrogen patch to your skin, it'll just diffuse right through your cells into your bloodstream and move around that way. So, so one of the things that our body does when it's detoxifying hormones like estrogen in our body is it'll attach a sugar like glucuronic acid onto it to make it more water soluble. And that means that we can now excrete it in either the urine or the feces and get rid of it. The nice thing about adding sugars onto these molecules is that you can also remove the sugars whenever you need to. So certain enzymes may be required, but it's reversible. So forming a glycoside is a way that you can control the molecule better. The other thing that it does is it temporarily, I forgot to mention this, it temporarily inactivates the compound. So if you look at salicin itself, at this state probably doesn't have significant anti-inflammatory effects because the sugar molecules is occupying that OH group there at the bottom and preventing that from interacting with various enzymes like cyclooxygenase enzyme, which is one of the enzymes involved in forming inflammation in the body. So once you remove the sugar, then the salicylic acid, which is the sort of structurally related to aspirin, which is acetylsalicylic acid, the salicylic acid now has this ability to interact with the enzyme and function. So adding a sugar to it can inactivate that enzyme, that compound as well. So lots of different reasons why you'd want to add a sugar, or plants would want to add a sugar onto these molecules. So when it comes to glycosides, I would say that essentially any phenolic compound and a lot of other compounds, if you add a sugar molecule onto it, it becomes a glycoside. So there are hydroquinone glycosides that we described, remember, like arbutin, which was a urinary antiseptic. There's other ones called cardiac glycosides. Now, sometimes when people talk about glycosides, they emphasize cardiac glycosides, but it's only one form of glycoside that affects the heart. Lots of other ones have no effect on the cardiovascular system. There are other compounds we'll talk about later on called saponins, and you'll find these compounds in licorice and ginseng. There are also anthraquinone glycosides, and these basically are a stimulating laxative and it has a sugar molecule attached to it. And in this case, the sugar molecule keeps it inactive until it basically travels from the small intestine down into the large intestine, and then the gut bacteria will actually chew off that sugar molecule, liberating the anthraquinone and then allowing it to be activated. So there's a few examples there. So the picture on the right is a compound called rutten. Rutten is a glycoside of quercetin. Okay, quercetin is a common bioflavonoid. And so when it comes to this process, what happens is this compound rutten, it can be through hydrolysis, these sugars will be cleaved off. A little bit of this will happen in your stomach because it's a highly acidic environment. Some of this will happen when gut bacteria will ferment these compounds and release the sugars. But in the end, once you remove the sugars, you're going to have the aglycone, which is quercetin, and then you're going to have the glycone, which refers to the sugar molecules. Now, you could add, if you look at the glycoside on the left, see those little OH groups there? You can add sugar to any one of those. So there are different glycosides for quercetin. Quercetin's the aglycone, and you could have a bazillion different glycosides of quercetin because you could add 1 or 2 or 3 or a million different sugars to the OH groups, and different types of sugars will form different types of glycosides. So, but essentially, the functional group is the aglycone. So even though you may have 100 different types of glycosides for quercetin, really they're all doing the same thing once you remove the sugar from it. So if you look at the structure here, anthraquinone glycosides, the GLC dot on the O groups, those are your sugars. You could have coumarin glycosides, you could have flavonoid glycosides like I just showed you with the rutten. You could have phenol glycosides like the ones in arbutin. You could have cytogenic glycosides. So lots of different ones that exist. Now, the next group of compounds that we're going to talk about, which is purely or almost purely carbohydrates, is mucilage, gums, and gels. And these compounds are associated with different types of fiber. So, mucilage and gums are rich in soluble carbohydrates. They're going to be water soluble. And when you add a mucilage or a gum to water, it basically forms a viscous liquid. So it becomes slimy. If you add enough of it, some of these types of mucilage and gums will actually form a gel. And so a gel basically is a solid, semi-solid sort of substance, jelly-like substance, as opposed to a liquid. So you might have slimy water or a gel. If you don't add as much, it may just form slimy water, and when you add more, it may actually solidify. And both gums and mucilage have the potential to produce gels. A lot of seaweeds and algae form a lot of gels. So when you think about agar gel, that's basically a solid substance produced by fibers found in seaweeds. So mucilage and gums in general, they will have a demulcent effect. So if you look at herbs like marshmallow, slippery elm, when you add in the water, they basically form mucilage, and it helps protect your mucous membranes from irritation and inflammation. And so our bodies produce mucus, and we can supplement with mucilage, which is kind of slimy water. Another thing that these will do, if you take enough of it, is they can function as a bulk laxative. Because we don't, because they're high in fiber and we don't break down fiber, it basically occupies space in the lumen of the bowel and stimulates stretch receptors to help maintain normal peristalsis. Another thing where these are often used is as an emulsifying agent and as a thickening agent in the food industry. So things like carrageenan, which is a type of I guess, gel from algae, is often used to thicken up things like chocolate milk or puddings and things like that. And then finally, any of the health benefits associated with fiber, it may have most of those, like lower blood sugar or lower cholesterol, could be associated with this. So although marshmallow has never really been used historically to prevent diabetes or for weight loss, just because it contains high amounts of fiber, it would have this potential. So where do you get mucilage? Well, you can get it in different parts of the plant. I suspect that one of the reasons why plants have a lot of mucilage, if you look at something like chia seeds, when you add it to water, they sort of the outer shell of the gel of the seed, sort of where all the mucilage is, it absorbs the water like a sponge, and then the chia seeds kind of almost look like little frog eggs, where they have this little, they're enveloped in a little thing of gel, and they probably, I suspect it does that as a way to store and conserve water. So that's probably why the plant uses it, just as a way to trap water into it, so it can help protect it through periods where there may be droughts and dehydration, to prevent dehydration. Also, the roots, the leaf, and the bark can all contain high amounts of mucilage. And again, most plants that are high in mucilage generally are resistant to drought, and it's a way they can store it. So some of my favorite herbs would be marshmallow, the leaf, the flower, and the root can all be used, or aloe vera gel, which is basically you take the leaf and you press out the gel, and it's going to be rich in fiber. And then slippery elm, which is another herb I often use for reflux and heartburn and things. It's obtained from the inner bark of the plant, and then when you add it to water, it gels up. Now, mucilage is a physiological product of the plant, and that basically means that it's produced under normal conditions. So those plants that we described already, marshmallow, chia, flax, aloe vera, it constantly makes it. So it's not stimulated, it's just a part of it that the plant is just normally is there. And so it's not in response to any kind of trauma to the plant. And basically it forms a slimy liquid or mass when you add it to water. Now, gums are a little bit different, where gums are produced as a pathological product. So when the plant is injured in some sort of way, a gum is released from wherever the trauma is. So if you look at on the left-hand side, I took my pocket knife out and I just sort of made a little incision in the tree, and you can see what's happened is after a few minutes, this white gummy substance starts being excreted by the tree. And so the tree on the left is the chiclet tree, which is where chiclets gum, like chewing gum, originally came from. So they would make large incisions in the tree, in the bark, and then when the liquid kind of oozed out of it, they would collect it in containers, and then they dry it, and then they'd package it up and make it into chewing gum. And I would imagine that most gums now are probably synthetic, but maybe they're still using natural products, I don't know. So basically, gums are different from mucilage because it's produced when the plant is injured. And there are other types of gums that exist. For example, guar gum, xanthan gum, Arabic gum. Those are all gums that can be obtained from trees and are often used in the food industry as a thickening agent. So you'll see that as an additive on a lot of ingredients in foods. Mastic gum is a gum obtained from a tree that grows, the chios tree that grows in Greece, and it can be used as a chewing gum. It's also often used in liquors. In addition, some of these gums will contain essential oils and some other components mixed in with it, and give it kind of a unique aromatic flavor to it as well. So gums, the gum component is the carbohydrate component, and it's produced when the tree is injured, and that's different from the mucilage. Now the next carbohydrate we're going to talk about or group are the beta-glucans. Now, beta-glucans include a number of different subcategories, and the beta-glucans are referring to a certain type of arrangement of sugars. Now, when you think of some common examples would be oatmeal and barley. It contains a lot of beta-glucans that makes porridge thick and viscous. That's responsible for the fiber in the porridge being kind of thick and slimy. It has a lot of benefits for helps lower cholesterol, may help with diabetes, may help with bowel movements. So just because it's rich in fiber. And then there are other beta-glucans that also have an immunomodulating or immunostimulating effect. Now, oatmeal doesn't have that, but some of the ones we're going to talk about shortly do. So medicinally, the important ones are going to be related more to the medicinal mushrooms. And the differences between whether they have a certain medicinal action associated with it is it depends on the linkage. So if you look at beta-1314 linkages, which is how the sugars are stuck together, you can see a diagram on the bottom right there. The 1314 linkage, it may act as a demulcent. It may have lots of fiber and function to help with heart disease and diabetes and things. But the 1314 linkage is void of any sort of or at least I don't think there's significant immunomodulating effects to it. Now, a number of different medicinal mushrooms like shiitake, ganoderma, Trametes versicolor, these mushrooms contain a beta-1316 linkage, and that particular arrangement seems to have an immunostimulating. For some reason, our immune system picks up on that strange linkage, and I guess maybe it fools it, thinking that we're being attacked by some virus or bacteria or whatever it is, and it stimulates our immune system to help fight things off. So a lot of these medicinal mushrooms are used to boost immune function, in particular as an anti-cancer and antiviral treatment. So shiitake mushrooms, sometimes it can be used for colds. It can also be used for chronic viral infections like hepatitis and things like that. Another type of beta-glucan is alpha-1,3 beta-1,4 linkage, and this is associated with certain types of seaweed. And carrageenan, which is, as I mentioned earlier, it's a thickening agent in the food industry. It basically it's a type of beta-glucan. To the best of my knowledge, it does not have that that immunomodulating effects that the mushrooms have, though. So, and then as an aside, alpha-glucans, which are not fibers, this is going to be your starch. You know, cornstarch is going to be an alpha-glucan, and it doesn't have any of the effects that we're describing down below. Obviously, starch can act as a thickening agent, but because we can digest it, it'll get broken down and it'll lose its effect in the lumen of the bowel. So beta-glucans in general, lower cholesterol, and specifically the beta-1316 linkage will have an immunostimulating or immunomodulating effect that can have antiviral and anti-cancer effects. So remember, 1314 glucans will lower cholesterol, but they do not have the immunomodulating effects. Only the 1316 linkage. So reishi mushroom, there's a photograph on the left. This is one that I grew myself. You can buy little mushroom kits for basically a brick of sawdust with the mycelium of the mushroom inside of it. And when you add it to water, the mycelium grows, and then it sends out little fruiting bodies, which is what you see there, the mushroom. So in case you didn't know, the mushroom that we tend to eat, the one that's displayed there, that's just the fruit. So you can pick that without damaging the actual colony of the fungi. The plant, or the fungi, not plant, it's a fungi. The fungi mycelium is what lives underneath the ground or in the trees, and that particular thing is responsible for producing these fruits. So you can continue to harvest this over time. So a number of medicinal mushrooms exist, including shiitake, reishi, turkey tail. These are all mushrooms that I've used with cancer patients. And the research suggests that they boost immune function and help, they just basically boost immune function and have some other benefits to them. So on the left-hand side, this is turkey tail. One of the either Corealis or Trametes versicolor is the name for it. There is a particular type of carbohydrate found in this mushroom called polysaccharide K, so PSK. And this is an extract from turkey tail, and it's fairly well researched. So just so you know, Trametes versicolor, Corealis versicolor, it's the same fungus. It just sometimes there's two different names for it. And what's found in here, this PSK molecule, it's a proteoglycan, meaning it's basically a beta-glucan with certain little amino acids attached to it. And it has some significant research, at least over 100 PubMed articles I found associated with it and its immunomodulating, immunostimulating effect. And I've used it for patients that have had cancer as an adjunctive therapy to chemotherapy and surgery and radiation therapy. It can help boost immune function because when you go through those types of treatments, it can suppress various white blood cells, including natural killer cells, and we need natural killer cells to fight off infections and also cancer cells themselves. So that's one of the very useful, or at least I think useful, mushrooms used for cancer therapy. And just as an aside, when I treat people with cancer, I don't think you, I don't think we can necessarily miraculously cure all forms of cancer. I think what happens is when you do natural substances, it increases the odds for survival. So some people have like only a, let's say, a 10% chance of surviving the first year. And maybe what you're doing is you're increasing their odds to 30 or 40% by combining a number of different natural products. So I had one patient who had ovarian cancer. She came in, she was given they basically said, you're lucky if you make it for a year. And then we treated her for, I think, 6 or 7 or 8, maybe even 8 years later. She finally passed away. She had ovarian cancer. It was very invasive. The prognosis is poor. But regardless, we were able to, I got to turn my phone off. Sorry. We were able to prevent her from getting, passing away in the first year. So I think what we can do with natural treatments is useful. Mushrooms is one of them. But just as an aside, it can also get very expensive. People could spend up to $5,000 to $15,000 a year taking natural supplements to increase their odds of survival, but then still pass away. So I like to always explain that to them because you don't want people getting upset. You tell them to spend $10,000 on anti-cancer treatments, and then they end up dying in 2 years. They may not be happy if they spent their whole, retirement savings. So the next groups of compounds we're going to talk about are nonpolar compounds, and most of these guys do not dissolve well at all in water, with the exception maybe of the gum resins, and we'll get to that in a second. So resins are basically nonpolar substances typically obtained from trees, but also you can get them from plants as well. So resins are a mixture of hydrocarbons, often terpenoids, for example, that we'll talk about shortly, that are excreted by the plant. So if you look on the balsam fir on the left-hand side, that's like a Christmas tree. If you put little holes into the bubbles there, just 1 second. I got someone we were having some troubles with recording this earlier on. I want to make sure that. Sorry, this is sort of important. So what the resins are is that they contain a mixture of various hydrocarbons. And some of these will be small molecules and some of them will be large molecules. And these compounds are basically non-polar, so they don't dissolve in water. So when you look at the little red circle on the left, that's a little bubble of resin being excreted from the plant. And that'll contain a mixture of essential oils and some larger compounds as well. They tend to be usually clear, but they can also be yellow or brown in color as well. And when you look at, there's some other ones like oleoresins is a specific name that refers to resins that also contain essential oils. Gum resins basically means you have the gum that we described earlier on that's rich in carbohydrates, and then it has some of these nonpolar compounds suspended in it as well. And I would say mastic gum, and even the chiclet gum that we talked about earlier on, probably technically speaking, it does have some essential oils in it. So it is a gum resin, but if it has a lot of the essential oils, it usually gets referred to as a gum resin. It's all dose dependent or depends on the concentration. You can also have oleogum resins where you basically have essential oils. I guess the essential oils and the resins and the gum all combined together would be kind of the accurate term for most of these gum resins we talked about. Now, a lot of the resins obtained from trees will have, I would say, anti-inflammatory properties and antimicrobial properties. Some of them have anti-cancer effects. Lots of different things. Now, as an aside, the synthetic resins that you may have heard of, like epoxy resin, are also semi-solid, slightly solid substances that usually are polymers of nonpolar compounds. And so when you use epoxy that you might pick up at the hardware store, it is not structurally similar at all to the resins from trees. It's just a synthetic resin, so it's completely different. Just the naming might be a little confusing for you. Now, just as an aside, if you look at the picture on the left again, you'll see you've got that nice clear liquid coming down, and then on the right you've got like sort of a chalky-like substance. We'll talk about that in a second, but that's rosin. That's basically what's left over once the essential oils evaporate away. And so that's the larger compounds that don't evaporate. So the oleoresin contains a mixture of the essential oils and that stuff there. Now here's a picture of some resins from trees. What I've done to photograph them to make them look prettier is I've just cleaned them off a little bit with a little bit of turpentine just to remove the outer powder, and then I've backlit it so you can see they actually have some nice color. So myrrh is the same resin obtained from Commiphora muco, one of the trees that grows in North Africa. It's one of the resins that was given to baby Jesus because it can be burned as incense. It's also a great antimicrobial. So it's aromatic when you burn it, and it also makes for a great antimicrobial for various types of infections against bacteria and parasites and viruses. Jumping to the far right, we've got Indian frankincense. This is a different plant than the frankincense that baby Jesus got. Indian frankincense grows in India. It's used more as an anti-inflammatory. It's used for arthritis, but it's also used for asthma and different types of colitis as well, and it does have some antimicrobial effects. Now in the middle we have amber. If you've ever wondered what amber is often used in the jewelry industry, and what this is fossilized resin. So this is resin that dates back to the dinosaur times, where it'll be obtained and then polished and cleaned up. And you sometimes will actually see little insects in the amber. It's quite pretty. And it can also be, all these can be burned as incense because they have some nice odors to them. And I think in Chinese medicine they do use amber in traditional Chinese medicine. But so those are some examples of resins. Finally, if you look here, if you have an oleoresin, what you basically are going to have is the essential oils. If you look to the left-hand side, this is going to contain things like monoterpenes and sesquiterpenes. These won't mean anything to you right now, but after the break, you're going to hear a little bit more about those. So turpentine, for example, is rich in essential oils from various conifers. So like pine trees, if you distill the essential oils out, you're going to get turpentine. And turpentine basically is high in alpha-pinene and beta-pinene. These are two different types of monoterpenes. And it's basically used as a solvent, a non-polar solvent, for getting rid of grease and paint and things like that. Not latex paint, but other types of paints, oil-based paints. And when you remove the essential oils, if you look on the right-hand side, what's left over, that chalky substance I showed you on the previous slide, is the rosin. This contains the larger compounds like diterpenes and triterpenoids that we'll talk about later on. It has a very sticky, chalky sort of substance to it, and rosins are often used for that sticky property for other purposes beyond medicine. For example, it's applied to violin bows to make it a little bit stickier and grippier. Athletes will apply it to their hands or to their shoes to get better stick if you're a dancer or a rock climber or a gymnast. And so that's what rosin is, if you've ever wondered. Now, another type of nonpolar substance are oils. So we talked about the essential oils already. I'm going to just go in a little bit more detail quickly on it. So these are very small molecules that are typically about 10 to 15 carbon in length, and you obtain it through steam distillation. So you apply heat, you blow steam through a mixture, and the substance that it evaporates off are going to be the essential oils that you then later on will basically separate from the water that comes off with it. So these will contain monoterpenes, sesquiterpenes, a few diterpenes, and also phenylpropenes. Those will all be discussed later on. Most essential oils will have a carminative effect, an antiseptic effect, a rubification effect. Some of them will have an analgesic effect. And there are several different plant families that are rich in these essential oils. So the Apiaceae family has a lot of the members, a lot of plants that are found in your spice cabinet. So caraway, fennel, cumin, coriander, They're rich in essential oils. And also the mint family, so peppermint, spearmint, thyme, oregano, sage, basil, lavender. I don't know any plants that don't have essential oils in those two families. There's also the Lauraceae family, which is a laurel family. Laurel is a spice. It also contains cinnamon, camphor, and sassafras. And then the Myrtaceae family, which is a myrtle family, which contains clove, eucalyptus, and tea tree. And most of these plants, if you were to crush up their leaves and smell them, they're going to be very rich in these aromatic oils. Now, generally speaking, small amounts of these essential oils can be applied topically, and even smaller amounts can be applied or can be taken internally without too much of an issue. So you can, take a few drops of oregano oil or eucalyptus oil or tea tree oil internally, and it won't hurt you. But some of them can be very toxic, and in general, because they're basically non-polar solvents. If you have like 5 mils or more of this stuff, it will make you really sick or even cause death. So be very careful about the amounts that you take. Peppermint tea is very safe because it only has small amounts of peppermint oil. But when you take the essential oil and you basically extract it and then take it in high amounts, in some cases, certain ones like methyl salicylate, clove oil, these things can actually cause death if you take too much internally. And even externally, they can be absorbed and cause problems. So watch it. Appreciate the fact that essential oils are more like a drug than they are like a herbal tea. They have risks associated with them. They're relatively safe. Don't be too worried about it. But definitely don't let your child play with a little 5 or 10 ml bottle of essential oils and get the lid off and swallow it, because that would be not a good thing. Okay? Now, a couple other types of oils that we're going to talk about are the fixed oils. Fixed oils are very different than aromatic oils. These are large compounds. Typically, basically what a fixed oil is you'll have like a glycerol backbone with fatty acids attached to it. And so the fatty acids might be 15 to 25 carbons in length. Glycerol is just basically a molecule, which is 3 carbon molecules with an OH group attached to each carbon that you can then form triglycerides or fats with. And so some examples of these would be, fixed oils would be, you take any kind of nut, seed, or drupe, and then you press it under high pressure, hopefully with low temperature so the oils don't go rancid, and then you can obtain your flax oil, your coconut oil, castor oil, things like that. So that's a fixed oil. These are big, big molecules. They do not evaporate. Just as an aside, when it comes to essential oils, sometimes essential oils will be adulterated with fixed oils because essential oils are very expensive, while olive oil and flax oil are pretty cheap, relatively speaking. And so if you were ever wanting to buy large amounts of essential oils from some manufacturer, one way you can test whether it's been adulterated with fixed oils or not is to put a few drops on a piece of paper and then take our hair dryer to it and blow it. And all the essential oils over time should eventually evaporate off. But things like olive oil or coconut oil will never actually evaporate. It's too heavy, so it'll leave like a little filmy resin, a little fatty streak where the dot was. And so that tells you that whoever is selling it to you is trying to rip you off. Finally, waxes, not so important medicinally, but I'll explain really quickly that waxes are different than fats, that they're much larger compounds, generally speaking. There are some exceptions to that. And they tend to be solid or semi-solid at room temperature. They're kind of malleable. And rather than being attached to a glycerol molecule, you have a wax ester. So you have a fatty acid attached to a fatty alcohol, and that's what a wax is. And the reason why plants make it usually is it acts as a protective barrier to help prevent evaporation of water. And so it's a way you can basically act as a water repellent or to conserve water in the plant. Wax myrtle or bayberry, which is seen on the left-hand side, the seeds are coated in a wax that it produces. And this was also called waxberry or candle herb. I can't remember exactly what the name was. And you can actually make candles from the wax of these berries. It's very expensive. It's not the most efficient way to do it. But if for some reason there weren't any, you didn't have any honeybee wax, then that would be something you could do as well. Now, in addition to plants making waxes, also mammals and insects do. So sheep make lanolin. So if you look at like wool that's on a sheep, it has a waxy substance called lanolin that makes their nice wool sweaters that they wear also waterproof. And so that's one of the reasons why sheep make it. Now, during the processing of wool, they'll remove the lanolin from it so it doesn't have that same sort of waxy feel to it. But if you get raw wool, it's quite sticky and waxy. Humans make earwax, and then bees obviously make beeswax as well. In general, waxes are not digestible, and when you consume it orally, it won't be absorbed, and it can cause like steatorrhea if you take too much of it. And there is, with this whole low-fat diet fad that happens, is some people will make, let's say, processed foods like chips and stuff using waxes because those waxes won't be absorbed, but the side effect is that you don't absorb the wax, so then you could end up getting diarrhea and things like anal leakage, which doesn't sound very pleasant. So here's an example of some fatty acids and some waxes at the bottom. Acetic acid, it's technically speaking a fatty acid. It's only got one extra little carbon on there. Butyric acid is a short chain fatty acid. This is often a byproduct of fiber fermentation. It feeds your enterocytes. Lauric acid found in coconut oil has some antifungal properties. Linoleic acid is an omega-6 fatty acid that increases inflammation in the body. And then at the bottom there you can see, here you've got, I believe that's lauric acid attached to an alcohol ester. An alcohol acid, not acid, an alcohol, what do you call that, hydrocarbon. Latex, it's the final one that we'll talk about. Latex is different because it's both water and fat soluble in the type of components that it has. So it's more like an emulsion, like something like mayonnaise, where mayonnaise is made from water and from oils. And usually latex is obtained when the plant's injured. Latex is excreted from it, and that'll contain both water-soluble components like waters and gums and proteins, and non-water-soluble components like resins and terpenoids. And the take-home is that it's in an aqueous base. So, classic example of a latex is opium poppies. So if you look on the left, there's an opium poppy there, and I used a needle to put little holes in it. You can see what is excreted there is the latex. And so what people do is they'll gather that latex off, dry it, and that's where you get raw opium. And then that can be further processed to make other narcotics from it. Now, greater celandine and bloodroot, we talked about that earlier on. Celandine is a good antispasmodic herb. It's also good bitter. It contains that orangey yellow latex there that's excreted, and that's loaded with compounds called isoquinoline alkaloids, as well as some other things, and that's basically one of the active ingredients. Bloodroot on the right-hand side, the root itself has a red latex in the root, that's why they call it bloodroot, and that's what's applied topically to warts to have an antifungal and antiviral effect. Okay, we're going to take a break right here, and then we'll continue with terpenoids when we get back.